The man known to history as Otto Skorzeny was born on the 12th of June 1908 in Vienna, the capital not only of Austria but also of the vast Austro-Hungarian Empire, which ruled much of the Balkans and Central Europe at the time. His father was Anton Skorzeny, an engineer and architect who was in his late 30s when Otto was born. The Skorzeny surname indicates the family's ultimate origins in northern Poland, from the village of Skorzykin in eastern Pomerania. Otto's mother was of more Germanic ancestry. Flora Skorzeny's maiden name was Siebersteiner Hart. Otto's family was relatively affluent by the time he was born, his father having run a successful construction business for a decade. His family was also deeply connected to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, his mother's family having had several generations serve in the Habsburg armies. The tradition of military service continued with the family into the 20th century, when Anton Skorzeny was called to fight for the Austro-Hungarian Empire as a reserve artillery officer upon the outbreak of the First World War. Otto was only 6 years old at the time. The war had a dramatic impact on Otto's early years. Like those of so many other people across Central Europe, Otto's childhood was shaped by the defeat of Germany and Austria-Hungary in the First World War, then known as the Great War. In 1918, the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed into a patchwork of smaller nations, resembling to some extent the modern political map of Central Europe. Austria emerged as a small rump state, one which would face many difficulties in the years ahead. In school, Otto showed himself to be a keen student of practical, applied subjects like mathematics and engineering, while also demonstrating an aptitude for languages. Otto had little time for the humanities and read little for pleasure. In 1926, he ultimately chose to follow in his father and elder brother Alfred's footsteps by entering the Technische Hochschule in Vienna to study engineering. Otto spent many years there, studying for an initial 3-year degree and then advancing to work on an advanced degree. One of his hobbies while at the Technical University was fencing, and it was during a bout he acquired the notable dueling scar on his face that would give his countenance a characteristic edge for the remainder of his life. While at the university, Skorzeny developed his political identity that would influence the rest of his life. In the late 1920s, Austria's politics split into various factions, such as those who supported a communist system, such as had developed in Russia following the revolution of 1917, those who leaned towards fascism, and those who favored Austrian ultranationalism. Communists in Vienna attempted a poorly planned and even worse executed coup in 1927, creating a wave of fear among opposition groups, including fascists, who capitalized on setting themselves in direct opposition to communism despite the coup's quick suppression. The coup and the fallout from it overlapped with Skorzeny's student years, and he was soon heavily involved in local politics. In 1928, he joined the paramilitary organization, the Academic Legion, which was effectively a coalition of nationalist students throughout Austria. This was a university branch of the Heimwehr, or Home Guard, the leading Austrian nationalist organization in the late 1920s. By the early 1930s, the Home Guard had cultivated links to Benito Mussolini's Italian fascist government, the nationalist movement under Regent Miklos Horthy in Hungary, and the National Socialists or Nazis under Adolf Hitler just across the border in Bavaria in southern Germany. Otto did not hide his affections for fascism and became a platoon leader of the Heimwehr in 1931. However, his success was short-lived in the Heimwehr, as the actions of Walter Prima, the leader of the pan-German portion of the Heimwehr, destroyed support for the Home Guard after attempting an inept march on Vienna to seize power in imitation of Mussolini's March on Rome in 1922. The march received little support amongst the party rank and file, which resulted in the sudden collapse of the Heimwehr. While the Heimwehr floundered, many transferred their allegiance to the growing Austrian branch of the Nazi Party. The Nazis, initially deeply unpopular in Germany with few connections to power, had soared on the political windfall resulting from the Wall Street crash of 1929 and the Great Depression which followed it. As Germany sank into economic crisis, German desperation led to support for the extremist party, resulting in the rise of Adolf Hitler, who became Chancellor of Germany in early 1933, thus enabling the Nazi Party to solidify its hold on the German state. Meanwhile, in Austria, Otto finished his thesis entitled The Calculation and Construction of a Diesel Engine, and began active participation with the Austrian Nazis, joining the party on the 1st of May 1932, after hearing a speech Joseph Goebbels gave in Vienna. Less than 3 months later, the new Chancellor of Austria, Engelbert Dollfuss, banned the Nazis in Austria and instead, along with his successor Kurt Schuschnigg, attempted to establish a form of Austrian fascism titled the Fatherland Front, which rejected union with Germany. The Nazis, throughout 1933 and 1934, launched a dogged campaign to overthrow the Austrian government, using Bavaria as a base of operations. Ultimately, in the short run, the Fatherland Front government succeeded in staving off this first effort at uniting Germany and Austria under Nazi rule. However, it would not be the last attempt at doing so. In the political vacuum created by the prohibition of the Nazi movement in Austria, Skorzeny set about establishing himself in the world after college. He started work in a garage, but within a few years he acquired a more lucrative position working for Meidlinger Gerüstbau, a construction and scaffolding company. Skorzeny had been romantically involved with the company's owner's daughter, Margareta Schreiber, since 1930, and in the early summer of 1934, they married, and Otto went to work for his father-in-law. However, the marriage would only last until 1937, when Skorzeny, having acquired a stake in Meidlinger Gerüstbau, cynically divorced his first wife and married Emmy Linhart just a few months later. It was with her that he would have his only child, a daughter named Waltraud, born in 1940. By the time of his second marriage, Austria was fully under Nazi control. After years of German remilitarization in the mid-1930s, Hitler had begun applying pressure in 1937 on the Fatherland Front government in Vienna, through which he successfully achieved the unification of Austria and Germany in March 1938, when the Nazis moved into the country militarily and bloodlessly seized control. It is unknown if Skorzeny played any role in the Anschluss of March 1938, though he later claimed in his memoirs that he saved the Austrian president, Wilhelm Miklas, from being shot, though the lack of corroborating evidence leaves room for doubt. More likely and more sobering was his involvement in the Kristallnacht of the night of the 9th and 10th of November 1938, when Jewish businesses and synagogues across Germany and Austria were attacked as part of the growing radical anti-Semitism of the Nazis in power. Skorzeny, who by that time was a member of the SS, the radical paramilitary wing of the Nazis, is believed to have been involved in attacks on at least 2 synagogues in Vienna that night. Kristallnacht was undertaken at a time when the Nazi regime felt freshly emboldened. Not only had Hitler and his government managed to dismantle the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which had brought the First World War to an end through remilitarizing extensively in the mid-1930s, but Nazi Germany was now beginning to annex the lands of her neighbors. Following the Anschluss with Austria in March of 1938, came the annexation of the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia in the autumn of 1938. The rest of Czechoslovakia was annexed in March 1939, along with the city of Memel in what is now Lithuania. By that time, Britain and France were rapidly remilitarizing in an effort to stave off the invasion of Poland that all throughout Europe believed was soon to occur. Hitler had made growing demands on Poland for its eastern territory. When Germany invaded Poland on the 1st of September 1939, after a false flag operation designed to make Poland appear as the antagonist, Britain and France had no option but to declare war on Germany 2 days later. The Second World War had commenced. As soon as hostilities began in September 1939, Skorzeny left civilian life and signed up for military service. Until this time, despite his membership of the Nazi Party and the SS, he had no real military experience to speak of. But he was a keen sportsman, was energetic, and at 6 foot 4 inches was unusually tall. Despite this athleticism, the authorities in Vienna deemed him at 31 years of age to be too young to be involved in the initial draft of soldiers into the German Wehrmacht. An effort to join the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, which had been constituted under the command of Hermann Göring in the mid-1930s, was also rejected, as Skorzeny's height was an issue. Fighter planes were simply not built for an individual that was 6 foot 4 inches. As a result, Skorzeny spent the first 5 or so months of the war and into early 1940 working in a military communications depot in Vienna, an office job which he loathed. An opportunity to escape appeared in the spring of 1940, and Skorzeny grabbed it. He was already a member of the SS by this time, but learned that the Waffen-SS, the elite branch of the SS, who were particularly committed to Nazism and racial purity, were looking for officers. Skorzeny believed that his technical background in engineering might be an asset as the SS was expanded to become an active part of the German war effort, one which would soon be in control of entire mechanized units of tanks and armored vehicles. Thus, it was that in the spring of 1940 that Skorzeny entered training as part of the Waffen-SS. The course of the war shaped where Otto Skorzeny ended up after his training. Following the outbreak of hostilities in September 1939, the Nazis overran Poland in a matter of weeks. A calm winter followed before a German takeover of neutral Denmark and Norway in the spring of 1940. Then came the much-anticipated clash between the Germans and the British and French, when Germany invaded the Low Countries and northern France in May 1940. The outcome was a swift success for the Nazis, as the French and British were roundly defeated in a matter of weeks. Paris was occupied and France effectively knocked out of the war. The blitz and blockade of Britain by air and sea, in an effort to force the government of Winston Churchill to surrender, followed. But then Hitler made his great strategic error. In the spring of 1941, he decided to largely abandon the campaign against Britain and instead turned eastwards to confront fascism's great ideological enemy, communism. In the summer of 1941, the German Third Reich initiated perhaps the largest land invasion in military history, as 3 million men crossed the border into the Soviet Union. The Eastern Front became the crucible of the Second World War. Skorzeny saw his first military action even before the invasion of Russia commenced. In the late spring of 1941, as the plans for Operation Barbarossa, the codename for the German assault on the Soviet Union, were accelerating, Hitler sent numerous divisions into Yugoslavia to secure the Balkans before the attack on Russia. Skorzeny was involved in these efforts in April 1941, though it was a relatively minor role in the baggage train with only a small amount of action against the Serbs. From Yugoslavia, he was sent towards the Russian border. Curiously enough, we know that Skorzeny was reading a copy of T.E. Lawrence's The 7 Pillars of Wisdom at this time. Though Skorzeny was not much of a reader, it seems that a work by the famed Lawrence of Arabia, who led the British involvement in the Arab resistance to Ottoman rule in Arabia during the First World War, appealed to his sense of military adventure. It was indicative of where he would end up as a commander himself within a short period of time. On the Eastern Front, Skorzeny was deployed with the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, which was directed towards Moscow in the series of pronged attacks which sought to secure cities like Moscow, Leningrad, and Kiev as part of Operation Barbarossa. The initial German onslaught was brutal in the face of a wildly unprepared Red Army, and by the end of September 1941, the Wehrmacht had reached the capital of the Soviet Union. Skorzeny had orders to lead his division of motorized SS as an advanced unit once the city fell. one which would capture several of the most important buildings in central Moscow, notably the Lubyanka, a late 19th century building which the Bolsheviks had repurposed as the center of their intelligence services. However, these orders could never be put into effect, insofar as the German advance stalled in the suburbs of the city in the early winter, and then as they were gradually pushed backwards. In the latter stages of the Battle of Moscow, Skorzeny was injured when he was hit in the back of the head by a piece of shrapnel. He was evacuated away from the front lines and was eventually sent back to Berlin to recuperate. Skorzeny's injury and return to Berlin occurred at a time when the German High Command were giving sustained consideration to the creation of an elite special operations division, or Commando unit. Such units had been effectively established by the British in 1940 and 1941, and had been carrying out targeted missions against German and Italian objectives in France, the Low Countries, Norway, and the western desert of North Africa. What such special operatives promised was possibly valuable results at low cost and the availability of specially trained detachments to carry out unusual missions. Prototypes of such a German special operatives unit had already been put together in the early stages of the war, notably the Brandenburg Regiment of the German Army, but this unit was superseded in early 1942 by the creation of the Sonderlehrgang Oranienburg, or Special Trained Unit Oranienburg. Comprised initially of 300 members of the Waffen-SS, the Sonderlehrgang Oranienburg was established by bureaucrat Hans Juttner, a high-ranking member of the SS who lacked military experience. As such, Juttner needed someone to command the new German special operatives. It was quickly suggested to him that Otto Skorzeny, who at that time was recovering from injury in Berlin, was an individual who had expressed an interest in establishing such a unit himself. Thus it was that Skorzeny became the leader of Germany's Special Operatives Unit in the spring of 1942. Skorzeny spent 1942 selecting and training his men. However, the German command already had ideas for where Skorzeny's unit could be deployed. One proposed mission was codenamed Operation Osprey, an operation developed in response to the entry of the United States into the war in December 1941 and the subsequent landing of American troops in Northern Ireland, as well as Anglo-American occupation of neutral Iceland. In light of these events, the Germans conceived that a backup plan was needed should the Allies invade and occupy the rest of the island, which was held by the neutral Republic of Ireland. Under the terms of Operation Osprey, which followed from earlier plans to invade Ireland, occupy its ports and force its Prime Minister, Eamon de Valera, to ally with the Germans began planning to parachute special operatives into the country if it was occupied by the Allies and to make contact with elements amongst the Irish resistance which it was believed would emerge if Britain tried to reoccupy the country. These special operatives would then provide aid to the Irish Republican Army and other resistance groups against the Allies. In the end, the Americans and the British decided not to invade the Republic of Ireland, though they gave it serious consideration, and Operation Osprey was not needed. But it gives a sense of the kind of operations which Skorzeny's new unit was prepared to be involved in. In his first year as head of the Special Operatives Unit, Skorzeny was plagued by the over-ambition and quixotic ideas of his superiors. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, for instance, developed a plan codenamed Operation Ulm, whereby he wanted Skorzeny and his men to strike at the Soviet Union's factories, which had been moved en masse east of the Ural Mountains to protect them during the German invasion. This was utterly implausible, but it took until 1943 for Himmler to abandon it, and then only so because the war in Russia had completely reversed, and the Germans were now being pushed back towards their own borders. More practical was Operation France, a scheme through which the Nazis aimed to provide support to anti-British and anti-Soviet elements within Iran, notably the Kashgai tribespeople of the south of the country. The Kashgai lived along a vital set of supply and communication routes where Iranian oil was shipped off to the Allied nations, and American-built weaponry and vehicles arrived to be sent north to Russia. If they could be supported in their opposition to the Allies, the Kashgai could effectively disturb communication routes here. However, only one commando unit ever arrived in Iran, and much of their equipment was lost on a runway in the Crimea without ever leaving Europe. But while Operation France was a total failure, it was a good lesson for the missions which lay ahead in 1943 and 1944 in logistical and operational terms. Skorzeny's reputation as a special operatives commander rests to a very great extent on a rescue mission which he was commanded to carry out in Italy in the autumn of 1943. The course of the war had turned massively in 1943. That spring, the Western Allies had finally achieved victory over the Italians and the German North Africa Corps in North Africa by seizing the Axis' remaining positions in Tunisia. With this achieved, a southern front was opened with the invasion of Sicily in July of 1943. A month-long campaign here quickly resulted in further victory, and the Allies crossed to the mainland of southern Italy. These events led to a swift coup in Rome, where the fascist dictator Benito Mussolini was ousted by his colleagues and King Victor Emmanuel III on the 25th of July 1943. Mussolini was placed under arrest, and the new government arranged an armistice with the Allies in early September. Hitler now had little option but to intervene in Italy to prevent a rapid Allied advance towards Austria and southern Germany. He consequently sent tens of thousands of troops into northern Italy. He was also cognizant of the need to present a facade of legitimacy to the German presence in northern and central Italy, and to that end, plans were considered for how Mussolini could be rescued from captivity and installed as a German puppet ruler in northern Italy. Skorzeny was chosen for the mission. Following his arrest in late July, Mussolini had been held prisoner in various locations in central Italy. Eventually, his captors settled on imprisoning him at the Hotel Campo Imperatore near Gran Sasso. This hotel was located in an elevated region on an isolated plateau in the midst of the Apennine Mountains. The hotel itself was on such an elevated position that it was only accessible at the time via cable car. The place had been chosen specifically because it was difficult to either enter or leave. Skorzeny spent several weeks in the early autumn of 1943 planning the proposed raid and gathering intelligence, conversing extensively with both Hermann Göring and Heinrich Himmler, both of whom were anxious to claim credit for any potentially successful mission. Eventually, a date for the proposed mission was set for the 12th of September. By that time, the German advance southwards from northern Italy had succeeded in retaking Rome and ousting the remains of the Italian fascist regime, which had sided with the Americans and British. Consequently, Gran Sasso was much nearer the front lines by that time, and the operation could be launched directly from Rome. Skorzeny set off with his men just after lunchtime on the 12th of September. They travelled on board a number of Henschel HS-126 reconnaissance planes, which were towing DFS-230 gliders. These were extremely wide gliders that 9 men could be airlifted into a region aboard. Each Henschel towed 1 glider, the plan being that 90 men were to be airlifted to Gran Sasso and rescue Mussolini from the hotel. These were a mix of Fallschirmjäger, or paratroopers, and Skorzeny's SS troops. The 90 special operatives landed on the plateau near Hotel Campo shortly after 1400 hours, just over an hour after leaving Rome. One of the gliders crashed on landing, injuring some of Skorzeny's men, but approximately 85 continued onwards. In tandem, a separate squadron of paratroopers had landed down below the plateau and had captured the cable car base, while also severing the telephone lines there in order to prevent word about the raid being conveyed to the wider Italian position in the area. The garrison in the Hotel Campo was now isolated, but with roughly 200 carabinieri there, they still outnumbered Skorzeny's men by at least 2 to 1. Skorzeny and his men barely had to fight. When they entered the Hotel Campo, the guards there surrendered, unsure exactly how many Germans they were facing, while General Fernando Soletti, a veteran of the Italian war in Africa, had accompanied Skorzeny on the mission and convinced the Carabinieri to surrender. Consequently, at approximately 14:15, just 10 minutes after they had landed, Skorzeny and his men rescued Mussolini. However, they could not leave just yet. For propaganda purposes, it had been decided that the rescue mission would be documented. Consequently, even when a German plane landed on the plateau to fly Mussolini out, there was a delay in doing so, as photo and video footage were taken outside the hotel to record the rescue mission. This was further complicated by the fact that a rivalry had developed between Skorzeny and Major Otto Harold Moores, the commander of the paratroopers who had captured the cable car base lower down the mountain, to claim overall credit for the rescue mission. It was for this reason that Skorzeny changed the plan and decided to board the plane with Mussolini and fly out. This was a small plane, one which was now overloaded and only barely managed to take off along a short makeshift runway. As such, Skorzeny's efforts to claim credit for the mission very nearly endangered the mission. Yet, he was hailed in the aftermath of it as Mussolini was taken north to act as the head of the Italian Social Republic, operating from Sarlo in northern Italy. Skorzeny's actions ensured that he, the SS and Himmler gained the credit for the Gran Sasso raid, a mission which even Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, agreed was one of great daring. Even as the Gran Sasso raid was being planned and implemented, Skorzeny was possibly involved in an even more audacious operation, which would have had greater ramifications than the rescue of the Italian dictator from the Italian mountaintop. Following the entry of the United States into the war in December 1941, the leaders of the Allied powers had met at regular conferences in cities in North America and North Africa, notably the Casablanca Conference of January 1943 and the Quebec Conference the following August. In mid-1943, Nazi intelligence received word that now the heads of state of the three leading Allied powers, the US President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin, and the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, were to meet together for the first time. The city chosen for their conference was Tehran, the capital of Iran, which had been occupied by the British and Soviets in a joint operation in 1941 to prevent the country's rich oil fields falling under Nazi control. It is believed that the Nazis learned in the summer of 1943 that the Big Three Allied leaders were to be in Tehran in October 1943, and that Hitler then approved a plan, codenamed Operation Long Jump, to assassinate them if possible while there. The deputy chief of the SS, Ernst Kaltenbrunner, was allegedly given overall command of the initiative, which he quickly handed over to a number of operational heads, chief amongst which was Skorzeny. There is a debate to the present day as to whether or not Operation Long Jump was ever something that was planned by the Nazis. What we can be certain of is that it was never carried out. Instead, when the conference began in Tehran, Stalin presented evidence which he claimed had been gathered by the Soviet intelligence agencies, the NKVD, about the proposed German plan. He then claimed that the Nazis, under the direction of Skorzeny and others, had sent agents to the Iranian capital and were embedded in hotels near the conference site in early October 1943, but that a Soviet counterintelligence agent by the name of Nikolai Kuznetsov, who was posing as a German officer in occupied Ukraine, had uncovered the details of the plot. According to Stalin, the Germans had learned that the Russians knew about the assassination attempt days before the conference was due to convene, and had pulled their men out of Tehran. If what Stalin reported was true, then Skorzeny was central to an audacious plan to assassinate FDR, Churchill, and Stalin at the Tehran conference. But the evidence is very mixed. On the one hand, Skorzeny denied any involvement in his memoirs, published in the 1950s, but there is substantial enough evidence to suggest that the Nazis did at least consider and explore the possibility of assassinating the three Allied leaders. However, it seems unlikely that it went far beyond this basic planning stage. Around the same time that the plans surrounding Operation Longjump were winding down, Skorzeny was becoming involved in a new mission which would become known as Operation Rosselsprung, or Operation Knight's Move. The Nazis in this operation aimed to capture the leader of the partisan and communist resistance in occupied Yugoslavia, Josip Broz Tito. Tito had been able to take advantage of the Allied invasion of Italy and Mussolini's initial fall from power in 1943 to expand his activities in the Balkans and seize control of large sections of the Yugoslav countryside. Through Operation Knight's Move, the Nazi High Command aimed to identify his Central Command headquarters in the Croatia region and launch a combined land and airborne assault thereon. Skorzeny was only one figure involved in the operation, one which was plagued by rivalry between competing factions within the SS, the SD, the Luftwaffe, and the German Land Army, to claim credit for it. It may have been for this reason that Skorzeny failed to pass on critical information he obtained from interrogating a detained Yugoslav partisan, that Tito's headquarters were in a cave near Drvar, in the Dinaric Alps of what is now Bosnia and Herzegovina. Around this time, Skorzeny also began excusing himself from further activity in the mission. When a considerable assault was finally launched against Drvar in the final days of May 1944, Tito and his closest followers were able to escape, despite intense fighting across the region. Yugoslavia was not the only region in Central Europe which was causing the Nazis increasing trouble in 1944. With the Western Allies having opened a southern front in Italy, the Russians advancing into Poland and Ukraine in the east, and a new Western front expected any month, many of Hitler's former allies in Central Europe and the Balkans were reconsidering where their loyalties lay. Romania soon changed sides in the war from being Germany's foremost ally in the invasion of Russia to allying with the Soviets. Fearing that Hungary might be next, Hitler had effectively taken over the country in March 1944 and forced the regent, Miklos Horthy, the ostensible king of the country since 1920, to remove Prime Minister Miklos Kale from power, as he had evidently been engaged in secret surrender negotiations with the Soviets. Thereafter, the Germans largely controlled Hungary, leading most tragically to the extension of the final solution to the country and the mass murder of approximately 400,000 of the country's 750,000 Jews in just a few months between the late spring and early autumn of 1944. However, by the autumn, it had become apparent that Horthy was also engaging in clandestine negotiations with the Russians. Accordingly, Hitler called on Skorzeny to lead a unit to Budapest to capture Horthy and try to keep Hungary solidly pro-German in the face of the advancing Red Army. Operation Panzerfaust, or Operation Armored Fist as it was codenamed, was initiated in mid-October 1944. On the 15th, Skorzeny and his men, who are now known as the 502nd SS Jaeger Battalion, having been renamed and reconstituted late in 1943, intervened at a planned meeting between Horthy's son and representatives of Tito's Yugoslav partisans, who were acting as intermediaries between the Hungarians and the Soviets. The regent's son was detained at this supposed meeting and sent straight to Vienna, eventually ending up at Mauthausen concentration camp. Meanwhile, in Budapest, his father responded by making a national radio broadcast in which he declared that Hungary was renouncing its alliance with Germany and had negotiated terms for the cessation of hostilities with the Soviets. But Hitler and Skorzeny had prepared for this eventuality and had coordinated with the Arrow Cross Party, an ultra-fascist organization within Hungary, for them to be given charge of the government. Hence, just hours after he made his broadcast from Castle Hill in Budapest, Regent Horthy found his position surrounded by tanks and men led by Skorzeny. Horthy ordered his men to stand down and was soon dispatched to Germany by Skorzeny, where he was held under house arrest by the SS until the war ended. Skorzeny's action led to the brief rise to power in Hungary of the Arrow Cross Party, headed by Ferenc Selassie, a regime which in the few brief months it was in power was responsible for killing tens of thousands of civilians. If there is one operation which he orchestrated which Skorzeny is nearly as famous for as the Grand Sasso raid, it is surely Operation Greif. As the Nazis were taking over Hungary in the autumn of 1944, the Western Allies had opened a new Western front in France with the D-Day landings. A swift campaign to capture Paris and then Brussels and the important port of Antwerp followed, before the Allies began preparing for an eastward drive into the Rhineland in the winter. As this occurred, Hitler decided to undertake the last major German offensive of the war, a large counterattack in the Ardennes forest of Belgium and Luxembourg in December 1944. The goal of the Battle of the Bulge, as it became known, was to try to slow down the Allied advance into Germany in the hopes that the Western Allies would fall out with the Soviet Union and place the Nazis in a favorable position to negotiate peace terms. While the Ardennes offensive was primarily to be a traditional counterattack, there were also plans for a major special operation to spread disinformation amongst the Western Allies, sow chaos behind the enemy lines and, if possible, capture a number of bridges over the River Meuse in the region. This was where Skorzeny came into the plans. Through Operation Greif, Skorzeny aimed to form a new unit of special operatives known as Panzer Brigade 150. The idea was for these men to dress as Allied troops in American uniforms and travel in captured Allied vehicles such as British tanks or American trucks. Men who could speak English were selected, and where possible individuals who could speak in passable Anglophone accents. These men would then travel behind enemy lines and begin trying to accomplish the goals of the operation. There were logistical problems in achieving all of this. For instance, only one operational American Sherman tank could be acquired for the mission, and finding men who could both speak English and do so without their accents raising suspicions was extremely difficult. Consequently, in the end, Skorzeny resorted to disguising German panzer tanks as Allied M10 tank destroyers, while the language and accent problem was dealt with by placing one or two men in each unit who were the designated speakers for them, despite the risks if greater questioning was implemented by Allied military leaders. Operation Greif began on the 16th of December, the same day that the Battle of the Bulge commenced. Several dozen men headed behind enemy lines in different directions. Skorzeny had given his men instructions to try to destroy fuel depots and ammunition dumps in particular, while also interrupting the Allied advance in whatever way possible. Accordingly, over the first few days, his men roamed around the Ardennes region, turning road signs in the wrong direction and, where possible, passing on bogus orders to several units of Allied troops that they met. Telephone lines and radio communications were also severed. It was clear to Skorzeny, who was overseeing the units remotely from behind German lines, that a bridgehead over the River Meuse could not be seized. But the initiative was still markedly successful. In some instances, his men sent entire brigades of Allied troops in the wrong direction. In one particular case, they convinced an Allied detachment to abandon an occupied village. But the ruse could not last for long, and within a few days the Allies knew that there was a special operatives unit of some kind operating behind their lines. Accordingly, checkpoints were set up to question Allied troops, but this backfired and created further chaos in some cases, such as when U.S. General Omar Bradley was detained by American troops after he answered Springfield when asked the capital of Illinois by an inquisitive soldier at a checkpoint. The GI in question incorrectly believed the capital was Chicago and ordered Bradley's arrest, believing he might be one of Skorzeny's special operatives. Elsewhere, the British General Bernard Montgomery had the wheels of his jeep shot out from under him by some Allied troops who thought he and his men might be the Germans. While Skorzeny's men did succeed in creating a great degree of disorder behind the Allied lines in the second half of December 1944, ultimately there was little that could be done to stop the Allied victory. After General George Patton arrived with the U.S. Third Army on the 26th of December and began pushing the German counterattack backwards. With the Allied victory in the Battle of the Bulge, the stage was set for the Battle of Germany. In the first weeks of 1945, the Soviets began amassing in northwestern Poland for the descent into Germany and on Berlin, while the Western Allies were soon heading towards the Rhineland. As this occurred, many individuals within the Nazi regime began preparing for the end of the war. Some, like Skorzeny's superior within the SS, Heinrich Himmler, secretly began tentatively exploring possible peace terms with the Allies. But Himmler was also aware that these would most likely not result in acceptable terms. As such, since the autumn of 1944, he had been preparing Operation Werwolf, in conjunction with several senior commanders of the SS. Skorzeny was soon drafted into the planning. The idea here was for small bands of dedicated Nazis and SS members to be trained to continue the war even after Germany was overrun by the Allies. In the spring of 1945, for instance, Skorzeny was training hundreds of soldiers in tactics, including sniping, sabotage, manufacturing homemade bombs, and also how to act in guerrilla-type cells, which would act clandestinely to undermine the Allied occupation of Germany in the months or indeed years after the war ended. Exactly how advanced the preparations for Operation Werwolf were remains a point of considerable debate today. There is no doubt that it was a real program which was initiated by the SS, but many historians today believe that reports about the extent of the planned resistance have been exaggerated, and that in reality it was more propaganda than a coherent plan for initiating a guerrilla war once the conventional war ended. In any event, Skorzeny was only able to commit some of his time in the last month of the war to the initiative, as, at the end of January, he was appointed as a more conventional military commander. Such was the dearth of senior German military commanders available by early 1945. Skorzeny was given command of a division of the German 3rd Panzer Army and sent to defend the bridgehead of Schwedt in northeastern Germany as the Soviet 2nd Belarusian Front or Army Group tried to push through the region towards Berlin. Skorzeny managed to hold out at the Schwedt bridgehead for 31 days between the start of February and early March, but he was compromised in his efforts by a lack of heavy machine guns and artillery, compensating for the latter by placing anti-air guns on the back of trucks. Despite these impediments, when Skorzeny ordered the retreat on the 3rd of March, it was not owing to a defeat, but because he had not received any commands on what he should do and feared encirclement if he remained any longer at his current position. By that time, the war was nearing its end, and Skorzeny was briefly sent westwards to try to oversee the sabotage of some of the bridges over the River Rhine, to slow the Allied advance, but was soon back in Berlin, where the Russians were encircling the city. A brief final meeting with Hitler saw the Führer award Skorzeny with the oak leaves to the Knight's Cross, the highest military honor available within Nazi Germany. Before he could even receive the physical lapels to pin on, he was gone from Berlin again, this time heading south towards Austria. What Skorzeny's orders were during these final weeks of the war, or what his plans were, remains something of a mystery. He was in Vienna for much of the second half of April, before heading for the Alpine region between Bavaria and Austria, where the SS were preparing for a final stand. It was here that he would have received news of Hitler's suicide in Berlin on the 30th of April, followed just over a week later by the additional news that the war was over and Germany had surrendered. It was at this juncture that Skorzeny and several other senior SS commanders in the Alpine region, along the Austro-German border, determined that a final stand or guerrilla war in the mountains was impractical. There was always the hope that they could convince the Allies that they could prove useful as a police force in securing Germany now that the war was over. With this in mind, Skorzeny and several others descended from the mountains and surrendered to an American division on the 16th of May, 1945. Once it became clear to the Allied command that they had Skorzeny in detention, it might have been assumed that he would be prioritized for interrogation and trial. After all, with so many senior members of the regime dead or having committed suicide, the Allies needed well-known figures for the main trials, which were being organized before the International Military Tribunal to be held at Nuremberg. Ernst Kaltenbrunner would stand as the head of the SS in that trial following Himmler's suicide. But surely Skorzeny would feature in another of the bigger trials. After all, this was the same man who had rescued Mussolini from a mountaintop so that he could continue the war in Italy, allegedly plotted to kill the Allied leaders, and had overseen Operation Grave and countless other missions. Yet this was not to be the case. Skorzeny was not even subjected to intense questioning and interrogation like other senior members of the SS. Instead, the Americans, whose zone of occupation Skorzeny had been arrested in, questioned him in a fairly relaxed manner throughout the summer and autumn of 1945. Yet he could not escape judgment entirely, and early in 1946 it was concluded that Skorzeny would stand trial as one of over 1,500 individuals to be tried at the Dachau concentration camp in Bavaria, the first major concentration camp which the Nazis had opened in southern Germany in the mid-1930s to detain its political enemies. Now it would serve as a court to pass judgment on hundreds of members of the SS and other Nazis like Skorzeny. Skorzeny was not long at Dachau. After brief questioning by senior figures within American and British intelligence, it was determined that Skorzeny ought to stand trial at Nuremberg after all. There he faced repeated interrogation for months on end, mostly relating to Operation Grave and other missions he had overseen. The Ardennes offensive was a line of particular inquiry for the Allies, as they had information that Skorzeny had been given bullets laced with aconite prior to the operation, and it was rightly perceived that if this could be proven, it could be construed as a form of chemical warfare. These were difficult months for Skorzeny, who was regularly in solitary confinement and had multiple health problems, which were exacerbated by his decision to engage in a hunger strike in protest at the conditions of his detention. In late 1946, the situation was such that he had to be returned to Dachau to have his gallbladder removed. The following summer finally brought charges, as Skorzeny was accused of various crimes in connection with Operation Grave. A trial followed through the late summer and early autumn of 1947. But the case against Skorzeny was always weak, and when Allied commanders testified to assert that they had effectively been planning something similar to what the Germans did in the Ardennes, the result was assured. Skorzeny was acquitted, but he was still not free to go, and as 1947 turned into 1948, he faced a denazification court and more than likely at least a few more years in prison. After over 3 years of detention, Skorzeny escaped in the summer of 1948. The exact details of how it was arranged are murky. Skorzeny, ever a self-mythologizer, would claim in later years that the US authorities had been clandestinely involved in helping him escape. But there is no evidential basis for this assertion. Instead, it seems relatively clear that a group of former Nazis or members of the SS entered the prison where he was being detained in Darmstadt in central Germany, dressed as US military police, and convinced the prison authorities to release Skorzeny in order to transport him to a hearing at Nuremberg. It was the last that was seen of Skorzeny for some time by the authorities. He spent much of the next year and a half in Bavaria on a farm rented by Countess Ilse Lutscher, a niece of Hjalmar Schacht, the former finance minister of Germany during the Nazi era. Skorzeny would subsequently marry Lutscher after requesting a divorce from his second wife. When next he was identified publicly, Skorzeny was in Paris, and it was 1950. Having been photographed and publicly identified in a cafe there, he absconded quickly from the French capital and headed to Austria. But eventually, in 1951, he determined to settle in Francoist Spain, which had remained neutral during the war, but where the regime of General Francisco Franco and the Falange movement was sympathetic to former Nazi war criminals and offered them refuge. Skorzeny spent much of the 1950s living in Madrid, feigning to work as either a journalist or an import-export merchant. Once he had settled in Spain, Skorzeny became a prominent figure in the network of former Nazis and SS members throughout Western Europe who were helping wanted fugitives to evade justice after the war. This network of individuals is usually referred to as the rat line, and involved figures ultimately absconding to South America and Argentina in particular. Skorzeny's own contribution to it, which he began managing from Bavaria shortly after his own escape from prison, is more typically known as Die Spinne, or the spider. In the late 1940s and 1950s, this grew into a large network of individuals offering safe houses to wanted members of the SS and aid to provide them with money and papers to escape from Germany and Austria, often via Switzerland to Italy and Spain, and from there onwards to Argentina, Chile, and other Latin American nations. This extended further to efforts to break some figures out of detention facilities in Germany. In 1951, Skorzeny managed to acquire the aid of the German industrialist Alfred Krupp, who had been involved with the Nazi regime and in the Holocaust, but had been released from prison in 1950 after serving just 3 years of a 12-year sentence. Krupp allowed Skorzeny to use the Krupp Company's business connections to facilitate the work of Die Spinne. In total, it is believed that the Spider and Skorzeny managed to aid hundreds of former SS members to escape justice in the late 1940s and 1950s. Skorzeny's first years in Madrid were eventful ones in other ways. While there, he prepared his memoirs exploring his wartime record and his Commando operations, for which he correctly assumed there would be an audience, as he had garnered a reputation as the most dangerous man in Europe in the latter stages of the war. He managed to acquire a contract to publish these in Le Figaro, the major French morning newspaper which had been in publication since the early 19th century. Not everyone was impressed with the idea. When the memoirs were published, it sparked a riot on the streets around Le Figaro's offices on the 5th of April 1950, during which hundreds of French gendarmes effectively engaged in a street battle with 1,500 French communists. Yet by then, it was the communists who were viewed as the bigger problem. With the Cold War heating up in the 1950s, Western governments were anxious to move on from the Nazi era, and tens of thousands of former collaborators within the Third Reich were deemed to be entnazifiziert or denazified, subsequently being pardoned or released from jail early, and then often employed by the government of West Germany. Skorzeny was amongst them, and he was deemed to be denazified in absentia in 1952, though he would never return to live in Germany and had to travel henceforth on a Nansen or refugee passport. While he did not return to Germany, Skorzeny did not remain sedentary in Spain either. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, he traveled extensively. One place where he spent a considerable period of time and seems to have wanted to settle in permanently was Ireland. The country was not entirely hostile to former Nazis in the post-war period, as it had remained neutral in the war owing to its historically hostile relationship with Britain. Skorzeny bought an extensive farm in County Kildare in Ireland and spent a considerable period in the second half of the 1950s living there. But the Irish government balked at the idea of him acquiring a visa to remain in Ireland indefinitely and refused his request. Elsewhere, Skorzeny visited Argentina on several occasions, where he was entertained by President Juan Perón, whose administration was extremely favorable towards former Nazis. Finally, and perhaps most significantly, Skorzeny spent some time in Egypt in the mid-1950s, helping the government train divisions after General Mohammed Naguib had overthrown the monarchy in 1952 in a military coup alongside Gamal Abdel Nasser. The units Skorzeny trained were possibly involved in the Egyptian capture of the British-occupied Suez Canal zone and the subsequent Suez Crisis in 1956. During these years when he was traveling and consulting with foreign governments in Argentina, Egypt and elsewhere, Skorzeny continued to play a clandestine role in the neo-Nazi movement within Europe. For instance, SIDAD, or the Spanish Circle of Friends of Europe, was a Spanish neo-fascist group that aimed to resurrect fascist ideology in a time of emerging liberalism in Spain, and when it was founded in 1966, Skorzeny was one of its original members and played a key consultancy role amongst its leadership for several years. More significantly, in 1970 he set up the Paladin Group in Spain. This fascist group, was established as a species of neo-Nazi paramilitary group, one which would provide quasi-mercenary services to right-wing governments where they needed non-state agencies to carry out anti-communist activities both within and outside their borders. It was formed by Skorzeny in response to the growing leftist and communist paramilitary organizations in countries like France, West Germany, and Italy in the late 1960s and early 1970s. The activities of the Paladin Group are still cloudy today. They were most certainly aligned with Salazar's right-wing government in Portugal and with the anti-communist movement in Italy during the 1970s, while they were also likely involved in training Arab jihadists in Egypt to carry out attacks against Israel. But claims that Skorzeny's group helped train US special operatives who were sent to Indochina are largely without evidential basis. The last stages of Skorzeny's life perhaps ushered in the most bizarre episode of all. In 1989, details emerged from within Israeli intelligence circles and were published that Skorzeny had actually been recruited in the mid-1960s by Mossad, the Israeli intelligence organization. One might view this as a spurious and headline-grabbing claim, but the story was confirmed by a former senior Mossad administrator. Further investigative work and studies have been carried out since, though it has been difficult to get fully to the root of what happened. From these, it seems that there was indeed some involvement between Mossad and Skorzeny in the 1960s. One theory holds that Mossad agents visited his house in Spain and under threat of assassination effectively force-recruited him in order to have Skorzeny aid Mossad in its efforts to limit the flow of military intelligence and technology from Germany to Egypt at that time, as Israel was mired in a series of wars with the North African state between the 1950s and 1970s. Another theory holds that Skorzeny was employed by Mossad through intermediaries and didn't actually know who he was working for. A third argues that in the aftermath of the arrest, trial and execution of Adolf Eichmann in the early 1960s, who was one of the senior figures involved in the Holocaust, Skorzeny cut a deal with the Israelis to aid them against Egypt on condition they made no future effort to capture him. The truth, it seems, may never be known, but this was a highly curious coda to Skorzeny's already colorful career. Not long after his alleged involvement with Mossad, Skorzeny's health began to decline. In 1970, he was diagnosed with a cancerous growth on his spine. Surgery followed, which was invasive at the time, and left him temporarily paralyzed after being operated on back in Hamburg. However, it was not enough to stop the growth from spreading to his lungs. He died in Madrid on the 5th of July 1975 at 67 years of age. His funeral, like his life, was controversial. It was held in the Spanish capital according to a Roman Catholic ceremony, but it was attended by many former members of the SS and committed Nazis who, amongst other things, gave the Hitler salute during the ceremony. His body was subsequently cremated, and his ashes were then sent back to his hometown of Vienna, where he was buried on the Skorzeny family plot. A second ceremony was held in the Austrian capital, one which was also attended by former members of the SS and neo-Nazis, with Austrian plainclothes police monitoring the interring of Skorzeny's remains. From amongst the many senior figures and military commanders who made up the Nazi regime during the Second World War, Otto Skorzeny cut something of an interesting figure, a German equivalent of David Sterling, who established the British Special Operatives and led daring raids against the Germans and Italians in the western desert of Egypt during the North Africa campaign. Skorzeny's exploits were colorful, none more so than his leadership of the mission which plucked Benito Mussolini off a mountaintop in the mid-autumn of 1943 and took him to northern Italy to oversee Hitler's puppet state there, while Operation Grafe provided an edge to the ultimately unsuccessful Ardennes offensive. Yet these acts of great daring, as Churchill described the Gran Sasso raid, should not distract from the reality of who Skorzeny was. He was a fiercely committed Nazi from an ideological perspective, one who never gave up his views and who continued to operate within European Nazi circles in the post-war period. As a result, he may also have been responsible for aiding many senior Nazis in avoiding justice during the 1950s and 1960s. Admittedly, his possible ties to Mossad and the Israeli state in the last decade of his life adds a further complicating twist to his life story. What do you think of Otto Skorzeny? Has the tendency to see him as a daring figure embarking on audacious missions against the Allies deflected from the fact that he was clearly an ideologically committed Nazi? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.